Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Alexei Miller, the chair of this Center for Studies in Cultural Memory and Symbolic Politics in the European University in St. Petersburg. And this panel is a part of our conference about the memory of the Second World War in Russia and abroad. We have four excellent speakers today with us, unfortunately online. We hoped so much to have you all in St. Petersburg, where we could compensate your contribution partially by nice views and nice drinks, but I'm sure we can do it later. Now, let me introduce the participants. The first to speak will be Professor Xosé Núñez Seixas from the University of Santiago de Compostela, Galicia, Spain. The second speaker will be Martin Aust, Professor of History and Culture of Eastern Europe and Russia in the University of Bonn, Germany. The third speaker will be Markku Kangaspuro, Director of Russian and Eurasian and East European Studies, very politically correct name, in Aleksanteri Institute in the University of Helsinki. And the fourth speaker is Sigurd Sørli, head of a Center for Civil-Military Relations in Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. Each of our speakers will have up to 20 minutes, and then we shall have a possibility to discuss things, and we shall take questions in the chat of YouTube channel where we have this translation, this transmission. And I will communicate these questions to our speakers. So when you ask these questions, please, first of all, tell us who you are, and then address your question to particular participant of the panel. And without further ado, I will give floor to Xosé, whose topic is Good Mediterranean Invaders, ? The memory of Eastern Front in Italy and Spain. Please, Xosé.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexei, спасибо, and thank you for this invite. Unfortunately, we can't be in St. Petersburg to enjoy this wonderful city. I hope you can see my presentation appropriately. Well, what I want to talk is about two countries which also took part at the so-called Eastern Front. I know Russians don't like this label and prefer to say Soviet-German War, or even some prefer the Great Patriotic War. Anyway, for us, it continues to be the Eastern Front. And they may, both Italian and Spanish experiences have some points in common and also present or display many differences. Perhaps to begin with, those who are based in St. Petersburg perhaps know this area. This is Krasny Bor, south of Kolpino, where the last big battle involving a more or less regular unit of the Spanish army in the 20th century took place. Just one day, on 10th of February 1943, more than 1,200 Spaniards died and around 500 were taken prisoners. This continues to be a certain place of memory for the Spanish officers' academies. This always tells that this was the last battle of the Spanish army in the 20th century. I mean, today some traces of the battle are still visible. I've been there, but there is no monument, nothing. However, which is also a reference, a point of reference for the Spanish military culture, is still the Volkhov front. I mean, this area between Novgorod and Podberezhye in particular, where Spanish were deployed between October 41 and September 42. And to give you an example, some weeks ago, there was a big scandal in the Spanish press because the Spanish Civil Guard, the Spanish police, gave a secret name to an operation on research, on inquiry on the Russian connections of some Catalan pro-independence leaders, and they labeled this inquiry Volkhov operation. So obviously there was a big scandal. How could you use, how a democracy could use the name of an operation conducted by a fascist army, etc., etc. Well, actually, these differences can be summarized as follows. First, obviously, there were around 50,000 Spaniards who were deployed, who were dispatched to the Eastern Front between October 41 or December 41 and their withdrawal, their definitive withdrawal in March 44. They accounted for one division, was the so-called Blue Division, a Spanish Volunteers Division, Galubayo Division, and it was a part of the Wehrmacht, the German Wehrmacht, with a special status. And around 10% of them died because they were withdrawn before the great Soviet offensive of February 44 started. And their remembrance is usually linked to two specific points, the Volkhov operations or the Volkhov front and the siege of Leningrad, particularly to places such as Pushkin and Kolpino, etc. While Italy was a belligerent country, I mean, they declared war on the Soviet Union, they sent almost 300,000 soldiers. Most of them were conscripted soldiers. There was a small unit composed of fascist volunteers. They were deployed on the southern front, I mean, north of Stalingrad, and their remembrance is particularly linked to a catastrophic event, which is the so-called Ritirata di Russia, the withdrawal from Russia, as a result of the Operation Little Saturn, conducted by the Red Army as a complement of the operations to encircle Stalingrad. I mean, more than 100,000 Italians were forced to withdraw in catastrophic conditions, and a great number of them were taken prisoners. And almost 40% of Italian soldiers died in Russia, either as a result of the military operations or they died in captivity. So this has conditioned the different ways in which the Russian campaign was remembered in both societies. Obviously, there are some similarities in the way in which apparently Spanish and Italian soldiers behaved towards civilians. There are also some similarities in the way they share a non-racist view of the enemy, of the Soviet soldier. And there also were some similarities in the way in which they treated POVs, I mean, Soviet prisoners of war. Although a number of aspects remain still unexplained, such as, for instance, to what extent Italians and Spaniards applied the order of the commissaries, or to what extent they also took actively part as anti-partisan warfare. In this respect, we may summarize this as follows. Spaniards were thieves, Spaniards raped women, Spaniards plundered, but they never took collective reprisals. While for Italians, I mean, they had a specific division, which was the division Vicenza, whose files are not available at the Italian military archives, which in theory was charged with fighting partisans, which was also responsible apparently for some collective retaliations. This has shaped a myth which is quite similar, the myth of the Italianski cara хорошо, the good Italian in the south, and the good occupier, dobre okupacji, sorry for my Russian pronunciation, in the north. I mean, the idea that both Mediterranean countries, soldiers from Southern Europe, have a more civilized behavior towards the civilian population. It seems that at least in comparison, not only to German units, but also to Hungarian and Romanian units, the behavior towards civilians by Italians, particularly Spaniards, seems not to have been characterized by, as I say, collective reprisals and racial prejudices. However, this has been obviously exaggerated in post-war historical cultures in both Spain and Italy, to the extent that in Spain today, even after democracy returned 1975-77, it still persists the myth of the clean blue division, which was even cleaner than the clean Wehrmacht. And the same refers to Italy, where there is a line of continuity between the myth of the bravo Italiano, the brave Italian soldier, who had apparently behaved well towards civilians in Greece, Albania, and Yugoslavia, and their behavior towards civilians and towards POVs in Russia. Obviously, there was a kind of contradiction, and this contradiction was as follows. War veterans from Russia returned to Italy after the catastrophic events at the Don front in February 43. Some months later, Mussolini fell from power, and many combatants, particularly officers, began to label the Russian campaign as Mussolini's war and not as Italy's war. And they tried to detach themselves from the Germans. I mean, the idea was those who were responsible for all atrocities committed on the Eastern Front were the Germans, while we Italians behaved properly. And even the Giovanni Messe, one of the commanders-in-chief of the Italian Expeditionary Corps in Russia, in Ukraine actually, wrote in his memoirs, 1947, we are unable to hate. Siamo incapaci di odiare. And since Italians are unable to hate, I mean, don't worry, we didn't commit any atrocities in the East. And the same happens to Spaniards. I mean, the idea that Spaniards behave well and all atrocities were to be, or Germans were to be held responsible for all atrocities. And the more we know about it, the more both tenets can be questioned. Obviously, very much depends not only on whom are you comparing yourself with, but also much depends on the specific circumstances on the front, which favor, in some cases, brutalization, and in some cases did not favor brutalization. Yet, the image, the icon that characterizes Italian post-war memory of the Eastern Front is the withdrawal from Russia. This is, for instance, the cover of a very successful bestseller in Italian post-war society from NCO Giulio Bedeschi, 100.000 gavette di ghiaccio, which is 100,000 pieces of ice. This became a bestseller, or The Sergeant on the Snow from another military writer. And they depicted this idea of a tragic fate imposed upon Italian soldiers, both by the Red Army, particularly by Mussolini's designs, and their German allies, who in theory would have not supported them, so that the result was catastrophic. This has created a victimhood, an idea of double victimhood. I mean, Italian captives, Italian POVs were victims of Stalin's cruelty, but also they were victims of German lack of tolerance or German racism. This is perhaps you remember that film by Vittorio De Sica, 1970, or at least you remember. I mean, I particularly remember Sophia Loren, this film. You see, I Girasoli, I mean, this Sophia Loren visiting the Soviet Union, searching for his former boyfriend, who was apparently missing in the Soviet front. The Spanish war veterans also detached themselves from the Germans. They tried to point out their benevolent character and the lack of racism. And there is a lot of Latino lover stories concerning Spanish falling in love with with Russian peasant women, and there were even some marriages, etc. And in fact, pictures like this, I mean, this was taken by the German soldier. It was the Spanish soldiers dancing with Russian girls south of Novgorod, are not easy to find in the German case. I mean, there are also pictures like this in the Italian case. This narrative obviously persisted during the Franco regime, although the Franco regime managed to survive after the end of World War II by transforming itself into a Catholic authoritarian dictatorship. So the Blue Division was not presented as a fascist adventure, was not presented as a division which was composed of at least 30% of fanatic fascists, but actually as a kind of anti-communist endeavor, as an anti-communist enterprise, as an act of retaliation because the Soviets had previously invaded, in inverted commas, Spain during the Spanish Civil War. So that a lot of sites of memory were devoted to the Spanish Blue Division, particularly after '54, as the last POVs returned from Russia. There are still some streets devoted to the Blue Division, to the fallen soldiers of the Blue Division in Madrid. And in some Spanish cemeteries, you may find this kind of tombs where someone who was fallen for God and Spain on the Russian front with the Blue Division, with the symbol of the Blue Division, can be found. There are very few examples, but there are still some examples of this. And interestingly enough, obviously war veterans were associated into the so-called Blue Division brotherhoods. They had a certain degree of influence during the late phase of the Franco regime, and they continued to publish a lot of books. I mean, this is just until 2002, but I mean, every year I'm collecting 8, 10, 9 memoirs written by ex-division soldiers. There's one reason why there are so many memoirs, because many Phalangist volunteers were university students or college students, so they were qualified enough and they had some use to write diaries or war diaries. And there is even some trace in the cinema, particularly these 2 films, Ambassadors in Hell and Silence on the Snow. I mean, this last film is 10 years old, and they still reproduce the same stereotypes. Spaniards behaving correctly towards civil population, particularly towards children, towards Russian children, Spaniards not being racist, and Germans being the bad guy, of course. And the same happens in Italy, and this is quite surprising because in the end, Italy after 47 was a republic, was a democratic republic, which was supposed to settle accounts with its dictatorial past, but this didn't actually touch the benevolent memory of Italian soldiers in Russia, particularly in the Ukraine. Since the 1990s, there's a lot of pilgrimages, a lot of initiatives promoted by war veterans associations or their descendants, even some specific military units of the Italian army, such as the Alpini, I mean the mountain soldiers, are very proud of their behavior in Russia. And they used to travel to places such as Voronezh in the Ukraine, or the Don Front, and cooperate with local associations. And one of their last initiatives were not only erecting monuments on Italian fallen soldiers on the Eastern Front, but also promoting the building of some schools, etc., trying to cooperate, trying to promote a kind of reconciliation. A good example of this was a couple of years ago, the so-called Operation Smile, Operazione Sorriso, in order to promote friendship between Ukrainians and Italians. However, the narrative, the main points of the narrative continue to be untouched, and they are still held by the military commands and by by officers' academies in the Italian army as a positive achievement of the Italian army in the 20th century. The fact that they participated at our war because they obeyed orders from Mussolini, but they behaved very differently from the Germans. And this is sometimes quite contradictory, as in the Spanish case, because at the same time, most of these officers, and particularly the war veterans, admired Germany and they were great admirers of German efficiency, so to speak. And this was even more evident in the Spanish case, where many phalangists in these fascist war veterans continue to see the Third Reich as a kind of inverted mirror of what they would have be willing to create in Spain. So they continue, they were the losers among the winners of the Civil War, but the losers of the Second World War, but they continue to influence Spanish historical culture and public opinion in a favorable sense. I mean, the idea that Spaniards behaved correctly, and they were the moral winners of the war. And this was particularly accentuated, this is my last point, it was particularly accentuated after the fall of communism and the dissolution of the Soviet Union between 1989 and 1991, because in both cases, Italian and Spanish war veterans say they published books or memoirs whose title was "We Were Right." I mean, we could predict that eternal Russia would once resurrect. There is even one novel written by a Spanish war veteran where he recreates a conversation with the Orthodox Pope, where the Pope tells him, well, you know, once in the future, the communist Bolsheviks will be gone, historical Russia will resurrect, and we have a word for this, which is called perestroika. And this has put these words, you know, in the mouth of a Russian Pope in Novgorod, where this is the Spanish section of the German war cemetery in Pankovka, close to Novgorod, as some of you may know. And in the end, we may use Spanish post-war memory of the Eastern Front as a kind of mirror, which also reflects some contradictions of Italian post-war memory of the war, which is, on the one hand, relatively comparable to the Western European pattern of post-war memories, but on the other hand, it also presents some lines of continuity with previous fascist culture, particularly in the case of the army. Okay, this was. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jose. Perfect timing. The second speaker is Martin Aust. He will talk about the current German debate on how to commemorate victims of Germany's war of annihilation in the East. Welcome, Martin. Jose, and we switch off our sound.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much for having me. It is a great pleasure to be a part of this panel. And the pleasure would be even greater if we had the possibility to go to St. Petersburg and have this conference on site. But be that as it may, I'm very grateful for being part of this. I will share my screen to start the presentation. And here we are. Okay. The current German debate on how to commemorate victims of Germany's war of annihilation, 1939 to 1945. Imagine there were no COVID pandemic, and you had the opportunity to travel to Berlin and walk the city center of Berlin, the center right around the Reichstag, the German parliament in the middle of Berlin. In that case, you would meet 4 monuments. Clockwise from top left, there is the monument to the murdered Jews of Europe. Then there is the monument to murdered Sinti and Romanis. Next, the monument to victims of euthanasia. And then there is also a monument to persecuted homosexuals. Of course, there is a huge gap in this ensemble of monuments. There is no monument in the center of Berlin to the Polish and the Soviet victims of Germany's war of annihilation. Over the past years, there were a couple of proposals how to change that. In 2013, Peter Jahn proposed to create a monument to Polish and Soviet victims of NS Lebensraumpolitik. In 2017, Florian Mausbach proposed a monument to Polish victims of the Second World War. And only last year, in 2019, Wolfgang Berns elaborated the proposal to establish a center on German occupation of Europe and the Soviet Union. Only last month, in October, German Parliament, the German Bundestag, took 2 decisions. On October 9, Parliament decided to establish a center on German occupation and Germany's war of annihilation and in Europe and the Soviet Union. And 3 weeks later, on October 30, the German Bundestag decided to establish a place commemorating Polish victims of German occupation and highlighting German-Polish relations. At a first glance, this seems to be a success story because there have been a couple of proposals how to fill that gap in the symbolic space of the center of Berlin. But however, these 2 decisions by the Bundestag overlap to a certain degree. Because, of course, in the center on German occupation and Germany's war of annihilation, the German occupation of Poland and Polish victories and Polish victims shall also be a part and parcel of the documentation which shall be elaborated over the next years. And then there will be another place to commemorate Polish victims of German occupation. So what lies ahead of us is that that the German government will create 2 commissions which shall come up with proposals how to make that center and how to make that place of commemorating Polish victims work. And that in essence means that these commissions will have to go through all the questions which were debated over the past years in Germany. And this slide is to walk you through those main issues which were discussed in Germany over the past years. In thinking about how to commemorate Polish and Soviet victims of Germany's war of annihilation, there are a couple of questions on which all those who participated in that debate, politicians, journalists, academics, historians, representatives from civil society could not agree upon. And these questions will resurface in those two commissions which are to design and shape the two institutions which the Bundestag has decided to establish. Question number one is whom to address. Neighbors and societies across Europe and Russia and/or Germans. There is no consensus on this question in Germany. For instance, there are voices saying that we established the monument to murdered Jews to tell a story to us and to reassure us, the Germans, that we have learned a lesson from the past, that we have learned a lesson from history. And what we are doing right now is to send messages abroad and to reassure our neighbors, especially Poland, that we have learned that lessons from the past. Others argue that it's not only about addressing neighbors and societies across Europe and in Russia. The purpose of thinking about how to do that sides of commemoration is also to reassure ourselves and to call ourselves to constantly reconsider our past and relearn the lessons from our past. The second issue under debate is function and form of memory. There are proponents which say, first of all, we should erect monuments. That argument is made by all those who are in favor of understanding the whole issue in terms of foreign policy. So what they are thinking about is a situation when, say, a delegate from another country comes to Berlin and there shall be a state ceremony to honor victims of Germany's war of annihilation. In that case, there should be a monument which these delegations can visit. And here again, the critiques say, well, of course, this is in itself not a bad idea, but we shouldn't stop at erecting monuments because usually monuments do not speak for themselves. There is a broader story, and to tell the broader story, we need a documentary center. We need something which corresponds to the idea of German building, of learning lessons from the past. Another debated issue here is multidirectional memory versus bilateral foreign policies. Some perceive this topic in terms of bilateral foreign policies. And their line of argumentation usually runs to say French-German reconciliation is done. At the moment, relations with Poland are strained, but Poland, being our largest direct neighbor, shall be reassured. And so what we have to do is to think about how to improve those bilateral German-Polish relations, and that then turns in an argument in favor of the monument for Polish victims of the Second World War. I really can see nobody speaking up against commemorating Polish victims of the Germany's war of annihilation. But of course, it is fair enough to say that when thinking about how to commemorate Polish victims, we also should think about how to commemorate the other victims of Germany's war of annihilation, especially the Soviet victims, and that leads us onto the field of multidirectional memory. So we have to think about how to create a space which pays due attention to all the victims of Germany's war of annihilation. The third point concerns how to address the repressed and the murdered in Germany's war of annihilation in terms of citizenship, ethnicity, and languages of self-description. And concerning that, there are huge tangents between historiography, academic and professional historiography, and politics of history. Those on the field of politics of history prefer to address that question in an outright and completely nationalized language. When these participants of the debate tackle this issue, the talk is always about, well, first of all, Poles, Belarusians, Ukrainians, and then also Russians. And what is completely missing in the talk on the political field is the very term Soviet Union. So there is a huge divide between the rhetoric used on that field of politics of history and the language of historiography. Because in academic historiography, it would be completely outlandish to talk about Germany's war of annihilation without addressing the German-Soviet war and the German attack on the Soviet Union and so on and so forth. And while politicians tend to address victims in purely one-dimensional national categories, historians pay attention to the fact that in history we see multiple identities in terms of citizenship, ethnicity, and languages of self-description. So, for instance, there is Soviet citizenship, and under the umbrella of Soviet citizenship, there are Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, and so on and so forth. And as a historian, I would also like to argue that that should be reflected in German memory culture. The fourth point at stake concerns spaces of memory, spaces of politics of history. They can be international, European, national, and regional and local. And the debate, which I'm actually trying to wrap up, most of all takes place on the national level, and to a certain degree on the European level, European in this case meaning the European Union. There is quite less attention to the international dimension beyond the European Union. And the debate in Berlin also does not pay that much attention to regional and local practices of memory the big question when it all comes down is why there is no thorough and inspiring debate in Germany. In a certain sense, the very title of my presentation is a little bit misleading. It is called The Current German Debate. And one of the things which makes me wonder is it really a debate? The presentation started with mentioning some few people who proposed new projects of memorial of memory culture and memory practice, and then of course some politicians in the Bundestag and Parliament were involved. A few historians have spoken out, but viewed against the background of history debates we have had in Germany. Remember, for instance, the so-called Historikerstreit in 1986. Remember the debate on the book by Goldhagen, Hitler's Willing Executioners in 1996. Remember all those heated debate concerning the exhibition Crimes of the Wehrmacht in the second half of the 1990s. That indeed were debates with lots of participants, lots of positions, and a very, very significant media coverage. Whereas what I'm actually talking about here is something which, so it seems to me, only a few people realize and only a few people participate in that debate. So one big question at the end is, what does it say about the current state of memory and affairs in Germany that such a huge question, how to commemorate those millions of victims of Polish and Soviet victims, does not have that kind of public attention which you would expect to have it. Thank you so much for your attention.
Martin, thank you very much. Yes, Markku, the floor is yours for the talk about when symbolic figures of General Mannerheim and Vladimir Lenin meet, how the old myths were swept to new ones after World War II.
So thank you, Alexei. Do you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes, very good. All right, I'm discussing about political use of history and how it has been changed during the World War II, and how it went before and after World War II and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I have taken as a cases two major figures in Finnish history whom we have used, for political purposes, for whom interpretations we have used. I guess that most of us know who has been Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim. He was in Finnish history, he was the war leader of our civil war. Previously he served in Russian army. 1918 civil war, he was leading the white forces in Finland for victorious military operations, and then he served as an army leader of Finland during the winter and continuation, so that means the Second World War. And he was a short period of time president of Finland as well. And I think that I don't need to introduce Vladimir Ilyich Lenin to you. But I discuss about how this history has temporarily interpreted their history and they have been used, and the political use of history is it's intentionally interpreted for political purposes. This is the short description or what it is about. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin was important for Finnish political use of history after the World War II because his role was interpreted that he so-called presented our independence because of his role as a leader of Soviet Russia, and in his signature was confirmed the Finnish independence the last day of 1917. And after Finland lost the Second World War as alliance with Germany, Italy, Spain, and so forth, we were very close to be also occupied by the Red Army. And one strategy for Finnish politicians and leadership was to refer Lenin as an guarantor of Finnish independence. And for that reason, we got a couple of Lenin statues also, different places in Finnish cities, different cities. One was established in city of Kotka, east, south part of Finland, near the Russian border. It was presented by Kotka's twin city of Tallinn, 1979, it was used exactly for the purposes what I mentioned. It was the declaration and symbol of for Finns. It was declaration and symbol for Finland's independence, agreed and unbreakable from the Soviet side as well. You can't challenge this also from Moscow. That was the assumption, and it was a common interest, but although slightly different interpretations to celebrate Lenin's role as a symbol of friendship and relations, good relations between Soviet Union and Finland. We got also Lenin Museum in the city of Tampere. Tampere is the third biggest city of Finland. And it became very popular tourist attraction, and it still stays there. I don't know if it is true, but I guess that it is probably the world in the Western Europe, the only Lenin museum which is functioning or open anymore. Probably there is not anymore so many in the former Soviet Union. This museum is still, as I mentioned, already open, and it continues more or less historical museum of presenting and reflecting the narration of Cold War time interpretation of Lenin and Lenin as a historical figure. Probably good example what to do with the mausoleum in Red Square. I don't know. In this museum has been organized also the Remembrance Day of the victims of totalitarianism during the 5 past years. Still Russian tourists for curiosity and interest, they visit, for example, and not only Russian tourists, but it's a quite popular tourist attraction in Finland because of this, rarity. Then the figure of Mannerheim, really leading figure of the official Finland symbol, many way symbol figure of between First and Second World War, and very contested person as well. But in our official history, his position and his symbolic value has been undisputed. His statue was established in city center of Helsinki in 1960, and on the Mannerheim Street and at Mannerheim Square. It became immediately or also very contested because of the history of our civil war and our history between two world wars and his role during this period of time. But for the, politically right-wing parties and people he represented in many ways very important symbolic figure. And for all state delegations coming from abroad to Finland, these delegations were led to put flowers on the statue of Mannerheim presidents and prime ministers and so forth from the West. But of course, Soviet Union was the only one almost only one who didn't do it at that time after, before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Latest dispute concerning Mannerheim statue in Helsinki was when the Modern Art Museum Kiasma was built up, and the argument was that it decreased the relative value of Mannerheim statue because this museum will be so dominant that Mannerheim statue lose its dominant visibility and it disappear somewhere within this new landscape. It raised up also some other more political orientated disputes, but I don't go now to these. As I already mentioned, Mannerheim was why he was disputed and why he was so symbolically important person was because of his role in our civil war. This led in Tampere, where was this museum, Lenin Museum, pretty much on the city center of Tampere. Mannerheim was the leader of the White Army who occupied this red Tampere in spring, winter time, if I remember right, late March in 1918, and the fight between Reds and White was probably the biggest, or it has been, historians has assessed it, that it estimated that it was, if we are talking about how many soldiers were on the field, it was the biggest in Northern Europe until that time, and it led to the fall of Red Tampere. Winners wanted to establish Mannerheim statue, and it has been established. After the war, there were 20 years contestation, dispute, struggle over it, because still after the Civil War, Social Democrats and mainly Social Democrats, but also some socialists and communists, they dominated the city politics, and for that reason it was not easy to make decision where to establish this statue. You see from the map that Mannerheim Patsas, so Mannerheim statue, is on the quite far away from the city center. Tampere is there on the left on the map.
Markku?
Yes.
Could you make the presentation full screen, because we see just the first slide?
Oh, sorry, I thought that you... Okay. Is it now better?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I didn't know. Yes, good that you said. Yes. Okay, if you see my mouse here, here is the Mannerheim statue, and then here is the city center. So because of this dispute and disagreement of politicians on our historic politics in the city of Tampere, it was actually it was set up in the middle of the forest here, almost 10 kilometers from the city center. City center is here. And you see from the Google map that it's really here on the forest. It's the historical place. That was the rocks where Mannerheim they looked at how his forces in transit to the Tampere and took over the city of Tampere. But of course, it's not the same thing like the city center. The purpose and plan was to set up it here, really on the city. This is city center, that it is here in this place. So this is one part of this contested history of Finland. City center is around this. Myth of Mannerheim in White Finland before World War II. He was the commander of the first freedom war for the independence of Finland. That has been one narration. He fought in Russian Civil War for the unite of empire and restoration of the emperor's power, and also what was silenced was that the German troops actually conquered city of Helsinki and the capital of Red Finland, not Mannerheim. And of course the history how Finland was more or less subjugated under the domination of Germany. German king was elected to Finland or decided. Then of course part of myth is the Winter War. He was a commander of the Winter War. The myth tells about the Second Freedom War. And of course it was defensive war for Finland. And then after that comes in Finnish narration this continuation war, which is in our narration separate war from German war attempts and the war politics, and it resembles more or less what we heard from José's narration about Italian narration and Spanish narration. We had a clean and decent war efforts for democracy and to return lost areas and so forth, and almost not so much or probably nothing to do with German. So this was the third freedom war in this narration. Although there was of course the common Barbarossa plan and plan what was the role of Finland to blockade of Leningrad and so forth. When we are discussing about the construction the myth, we have to Mannerheim became as because we of course Finland understood that we will lose and Germany will lose the war. We got to very hurry to get rid of our alliance to make separate peace for Soviet Union, and Mannerheim replaced at that time president of Finland as a president and led us to the peace treaty with the Soviet Union, and for that this gave us a possibility to, after the end of the Second World War, during the Cold War, create that kind of very useful narration of Finnish separate war story, and Mannerheim became as a symbol of our Western orientation, because as we know very well, he was not Germanophile, but he was more or less oriented towards French and Britain, although the history of the alliance with Germans. And he became also, like was mentioned already, how Spanish Franco governance was transformed from fascist or Franco type of fascist government to some kind of Catholic anti-communist government and regime, and more or less same happened with Mannerheim. He became as an anti-Soviet and anti-communist leader, and got during the Cold War, it was allowed us to continue this narration about our own separate war narration, and in this respect Mannerheim was very useful symbolic person. Now, of course, there was also the fact that Mannerheim was as a Russian, trained by Russian military education. He was ready to make military union with the Soviet Union, which didn't become true, at least, but this is not so much discussed in Finnish historiography or this political narration. He was one of the leading persons who also agreed and led us to agree. Our Finnish politicians majority were against the agreement of friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance between Finland and Soviet Union in 1948. And it was actually President Paasikivi, at that time president, who made the agreement so that it avoided the intended degree of military union, what Mannerheim was ready to agree. Then, of course, between world wars, what we are, when we go to Lenin, he was more or less ethnicized, Asian, Bolshevik, or Jewish person, like used to be at that time, 1920s and 30s, these narrations against Bolshevik Soviet Russia, and it was description and used very much also in Finland. At that time, it was the fact or the Lenin's role was not emphasized in process of our independence, same way like after the Second World War. He was a representative of Red Empire, dangerous to Finland. It was otherizing and all that kind of. Finland was a vanguard of Western civilization, how we presented ourselves. After the World War II, as I already mentioned, he became a symbol representing a new friendship and friendly relations between the Soviet Union and Finland, and that it became very dominant feature to represent a new present a new interpretation of our common history. Starting from Grand Duchy of or autonomy of Finland under the Russian Empire, and how it benefited Finnish development and led finally to our independence and so forth. It's a question of big continuation. What Russia, founding father of the Soviet Union, had given to Finland, that his successors can't take away. That was the main thesis or understanding. I jump because I see that I'm just meeting the time. Revolutionary Lenin faded away, and instead of he became this symbol of good relations. And he was mentioned by Finnish politicians also very often and at common meetings between Soviet and Finnish leaders. After the collapse of the USSR, Lenin was abandoned by both sides, more or less, and there was a vacuum of the symbols to be filled up. And it was interesting narration what happened after that. Mannerheim stepped into the picture from both sides. Mannerheim fitted well to Russian discourse. He was brave white officer of empire, representing the greatness and honest moral values of empire. He was also resource for anti-communist history writing of the 1990s of Russian reinterpretation of Russian history, and he fitted very well for discussions for Russia's domestic policy. And he was a loyal Russophile, defending the holy entity of empire in the midst of the period of time in Russia when there was the danger of the, scattering of, Northern Caucasus and so forth, these wars and problems of the whole Russian state. And he, of course, he was a representative of legal monarchist order. Of course, what was not fitting into Mannerheim mood and what was not mentioned in these discussions, he was anti-democratic royalist, and he was supporter of reunification of Russian Empire. Minority nations didn't matter for him, and he was commander of Finland's army allied with Germany in World War II, and of course under his commander were this not only Leningrad siege but established concentration camps in Karelia, Russian Karelia, but both sides kept alive more or less this false explanation, historically false explanation why Mannerheim didn't respond positively to Germans' request to attack to Leningrad in 1941. There were different kind of invented narrations that how much Mannerheim loved Russian and Leningrad or St. Petersburg culture and his lovers there and so forth, and he was so fond of the city that he didn't for that reason attack, or that he was so Western orientated or whatever. In Finland, we didn't need, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, abandon our narration of Mannerheim as a symbol of freedom wars. Actually, Russians turned to our side, or agreeing more or less this narration, and this anti-communist attitude united history, united both parties at that time. And then Mannerheim was realpolitik also in good and bad. The construction of Mannerheim mood in contemporary history studies has of course continued and is going on, and there are several features which I only put on that you can see. We know that he was not so great war leader. He was more or less incompetent already, old man, sick man, and he was responsible illegal executions and war crimes and so forth and so forth. And also in Finnish history, he was on the wrong side of history if we are speaking about democracy and democratic development and so forth. But this is another story, it's not another side of this political use of history. Today, Lenin and Mannerheim meet as contested symbols. This is the left side, is the picture of the Lenin in the Finland station in St. Petersburg after someone has blown up this TNT explosion bomb front into his back. And in Mannerheim, He is in Tampere, but almost every year someone has so-called vandalized or protested. This tradition is still continuing, and here is written that he is slaughtered. And it is direct reference to our civil war and what happened at that time. So they are still on the more or less on the place, but probably and partly used as a symbolic. Someone has, depending on the space and then time, used different ways. But here I would say that they also meet. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Shirley, are you with us? Yes. So Sigurd Shirley will speak about heroes and villains, resistance fighters, and Nazi collaborators in Norwegian memory from 1945 to the COVID times.
Thank you very much, Alexei. Thanks for inviting me, giving me this chance to disseminate my research to a Russian audience. I was invited to give a talk on the roles of the military resistance and military collaboration in Norwegian memory related to World War II. Before I start or turn to the memory side of it, I would like to give you a very brief outline of the situation in Norway during the war. Norway is a small country in the periphery, so I'm not sure that everyone are familiar with its history. Norway was a neutral country until it was invaded by Nazi Germany on 9th of April 1940. In June, the fighting was over and the Norwegian government was forced in exile, where it stayed until the war was over in 1945. Back in Norway in 1940, the occupier established a civil administration headed by a German Reichskommissar. And in the fall of 1940, all political parties were banned. But Hitler insisted on giving Vidkun Quisling and his small fascist party, the National Samling, or National Unification, a political role in the occupied country. The Germans, of course, remained in charge, but in close cooperation with Quisling and his party. And in 1942, Quisling was even appointed a formal head of state. The occupation, and not least the efforts led by the National Samling to Nazify Norwegian society, soon met with protests and resistance. The home front or resistance can be divided into a civil and a military branch, and there is no doubt that civil resistance against the Nazification's efforts dominated in Norway, at least until the final months of the war. In this presentation, I will primarily focus on the organized military resistance groups that gradually came under the command of the Norwegian exile government and the armed forces in exile. There were also armed groups attached to the Norwegian Communist Party, and there were tensions. There was cooperation, but also rivalry and tension between the communist resistance and the regular resistance. But in this presentation, I will, when I refer to the resistance, I will only or primarily refer to the regular resistance and only to the communist when I explicitly state so. The second group that we will be dealing with in this presentation is the military collaborators from the National Samling, the small fascist party. Although there were other groups of military collaborators in Norway, I will confine myself to those who volunteered to serve with Germany's armed forces outside of occupied Norway. These roughly 4,500 Norwegians mainly ended up in the Waffen-SS, i.e. that is the military branch of Heinrich Himmler's SS organization. And the majority of them served in SS units on the Eastern Front. In my presentation, the group will be referred to as the SS or Waffen-SS volunteers. Now, let's turn to the topic of my presentation, namely the Norwegian memory of war and occupation. In crude terms, Norwegian post-war memory has displayed the same main characteristics and is other Western European countries formerly under Nazi occupation, like France, Belgium, the Netherlands. For several decades after 45, these were all characterized by a dominant patriotic memory. According to previous research on Norway, the patriotic narrative has tended to first understand the occupation within a national framework of an epic struggle between good and evil. Secondly, to define the occupation above all as a history of resistance. Three, to emphasize military rather than civil resistance. And four, to blur the distinction between active resistance and daily life experiences in such a way as to facilitate the inclusion of the entire nation in the heroic struggle against the occupiers and the Norwegian henchmen. And lastly, to present supporters of the National Samling, the small fascist party, as a marginal minority of morally loose, unreliable, stupid, cowardly, and incompetent people, often with criminal tendencies. On this background, it would be natural to assume that the two categories under scrutiny, the military resistance and the SS volunteers, have been given the roles as heroes and villains, respectively, in Norwegian memory. However, I will argue that the reality has been far more complex. Let's begin with the first post-war decades, from the liberation of Norway in 1945 until roughly 1970, what I have labeled here the heyday of patriotic memory. At least during the initial stage of this period, there is no doubt that the dominant memorialization of the war and occupation largely conformed to the characteristics associated with patriotic memory. The role of resistance in a wide sense completely dominated representations of the war, and the military resistance took on a prominent role in the narrative of events. Examples of heroic depictions are not hard to find. Although there is no doubt that the military resistance played a significant role in the popular memory, the claim that military resistance was emphasized more than civil resistance, at least in written accounts of the war, is more questionable, in my view. In contrast to military resistance, military collaboration with the Germans played a completely marginal role in the prevailing memory in this decades. Along with other former members of the National Samling, the Waffen-SS volunteers were prosecuted and sentenced as part of the legal purge after the war. In books and newspaper articles, they were, at least initially, depicted as a small group of mentally defective or social misfits who had betrayed their nation during the war. Hardly anyone were genuinely interested in their motives or what they had experienced or participated in while serving with the Germans in the East. At least in general, I find the dominance and character of the patriotic memory satisfyingly explained in the existing research on Western Europe, for example, in Peter Legros' accounts. I don't find it necessary to dwell deep into this. Instead, I will add an important nuance regarding collaborators and Waffen-SS volunteers. From a surprisingly early stage, it is possible to observe a far more nuanced and sympathetic view of the collaborators in general, and there was a particularly apparent tendency to adopt a rather favorable approach to the SS volunteers, often stressing the group's young age, misguided idealism, and willingness to sacrifice for a higher cause. In other words, the claim that this group represented the incarnation of evil in the patriotic narrative simply does not stand up to scrutiny, even if we confine ourselves to the early post-war period. In the period from 1970 until approximately 1990, Norwegian memory turned significantly more diverse. The previous fixation on national resistance and the tendency to ignore other topics and interpretive frameworks became less apparent and met with explicit criticism from a younger generation of historians. Particularly evident was an increased interest both among scholars, documentary authors, and journalists in the history of the National Samling and its members. Some even questioned the idea of a unified nation taking part in a joint struggle against the occupier and a small group of traitors. There was a general widening of the thematic scope, and some called attention to topics that would later play a key role in the public discourse. For example, the arrest and deportation of the Norwegian Jews. Despite these tendencies, there are few indications that the predominant patriotic memory was seriously challenged by oppositional discourses during this period. However, I would argue that there was an exception to this, namely the approach to and representation of the ideological collaborators in the National Samling. In contrast to preceding decades, there was an evident interest in gaining more knowledge about the party and its members. This also holds true for the SS volunteers, and I would say particularly maybe for the SS volunteers. Let me give you an example. In 1972, when a group of volunteers published an anthology on their experiences on the Eastern Front, the foreword was written by Wilhelm Hansten. Hansten was not just anybody. He was a retired general who had, among other prominent positions, served as Norway's chief of defense during the war. When a few years later, in 1977, the first scholarly book on the topic appeared, the author was Svein Blindheim, a famous veteran of the resistance and the Special Operations Executive, the British SOE. In retrospect, it is striking to what extent Blindheim, this author, had accepted the SS volunteers' apologetic narrative. For example, he downplayed the group's National Socialist motivation and practically acquitted the volunteers of any complicity in Nazi crimes. In subsequent decades, these flaws tended to be incorporated in other books and accounts and articles. Hence, if the volunteers had played the role of the villains in the dominant memory during the early post years, by 1990, they had largely succeeded in promoting an image of themselves as young anti-communists and patriots who had fought a noble war against communism in the East. Why did Norwegian memory evolve in a more diverse direction during the 70s and 80s? Before trying to indicate an answer, I have to emphasize that I have not really done any research into this. Yet, if you allow me to speculate, I would like to draw attention to three possible factors. One, there was a new and younger generation of historians that entered the scene during this period. In contrast to the first generation, they had not experienced the war at all. They had only seen it from the perspective, if they had been born during the war, they had only seen it through the eyes of a child. Shaped by the different experiences and the radical intellectual climate of the 1960s and 70s, they started to raise new questions and introduce new topics and perspectives, often bringing them in opposition to the first generation. A similar shift can also be observed among journalists and documentary authors. Secondly, oppositional memories came to the fore. Ever since the war, the memories of outgroups, such as the former members of the National Samling, and those who had belonged to the communist resistance as well, had been lurking under the surface. From the 70s, these groups became more active in promoting their own narratives. As we have seen, the SS volunteers were not without success. Thirdly, I would also mention that Norwegian memory did not evolve in a vacuum. It was shaped by transnational influences. And as an example, we could mention, for example, the TV series on Holocaust. During the period between 1990 and 2020, there was tendencies of the preceding decades to becoming more distinct. Publicists and scholarly historians from the early 1990s continued to engage with previously neglected topics and to adopt new approaches. Contrary to predictions, the public interest in the war did not diminish. Books, movies, and TV documentaries dealing with various aspects of the war has continued to appear at an incredibly high rate, often attracting huge attention and leading to heated public debates. When looking back on the last 30 years of Norwegian memory, some trends are particularly evident and relevant in our context. The first is an initial receptiveness to the oppositional narratives conveyed by Waffen-SS veterans and other former adherents of the National Samling. As noted above, or already, this trend had already been evident in the case of the Waffen-SS volunteers, who from the 1970s were successful in furthering their own country memory. This success culminated with the publication of several autobiographical and documentary books during the 1990s and early 2000s, all of which were marked by a distinctive apologetic character. Equally striking, however, is the extent to which this discourse was challenged as a new and critical focus on Nazi ideology and Nazi crimes gathered momentum from around the turn of the century. Since around 2005, a far more critical approach to the volunteers and to the National Samling has become completely dominant and led to the marginalization of this oppositional discourse. A further trend of particular relevance in our context is a growing tendency to question and criticize the role and conduct of the Norwegian resistance. From the early 1990s, this trend has become manifest in a growing number of documentary and scholarly books, in media debates, satirical literature, and TV series. Since then, it has grown even stronger, and the critical approach to the government-loyal resistance and the narratives associated with it is currently one of the defining features of Norwegian memory. In fact, a major ongoing controversy may serve as the perfect illustration of this strand of Norwegian memory. In 2018, a prominent Norwegian journalist published a book in which he claimed that the Norwegian resistance received warnings before the arrest and deportation of the Norwegian Jews in 1942. Moreover, she claimed that despite the warnings, members of the resistance did little to assist the Jews, that they were driven by profit motives whenever they did, and that the response reflected deep-seated and widespread anti-Semitic sentiments. Although the account received fierce criticism from Norway's leading experts in the Holocaust, it was praised by most newspaper reviewers and became a best-selling and award-winning book. A few weeks ago, three scholars or three academic historians published a thorough evaluation of the book, in which they document that the account's main arguments rests on systematic misrepresentation and manipulation of the source material. The author and the publisher have so far rejected that the book suffers from any serious flaws, claiming that the scholarly community remains stuck in the framework of home front history. How can we explain these dramatic shifts in the memorialization of the resistance and the Waffen-SS volunteers? Again, I can only suggest, with reservations, some factors that may help us understand the changes. I have already called attention to oppositional discourses furthered by particular groups. These groups work to gain public recognition for certain memories and narratives, which in very different ways challenge what they defined as the prevailing interpretations of the past. I've mentioned specifically the SS volunteers, as well as the left-wing actors sympathetic to the communist resistance. But I could have listed a number of social, regional, ethnic groups that all tried to further specific memories at odds with the dominant narrative as they understood it. In the decades after 1990, these particularist narratives gradually gained striking approval, for example, reflected in the apologies of Norwegian authorities to different groups that had been victims of injustices during and after the war. I can only scratch the surface of this process in my presentation, but it must, at least partly, be related to two powerful intellectual and political forces that affected Norway significantly during this period. The first is an increased skepticism toward traditional ideologies, including so-called master narratives, that is often associated with the term postmodernism. The second is the influence of more human rights-oriented discourse, a generally more human rights-oriented discourse. Together and independently, these potent ideological forces help to explain the shifts in memory regarding our two groups. The SS volunteers clearly benefited from the tendency to question national master narratives in the 1990s. The new intellectual climate created a higher degree of receptivity than before and made it possible to underpin the group's particularist and largely false narrative with concepts and perspectives borrowed, among others, from the field of memory studies. Similarly, the marginalization of the same group's counter-narrative from around 2000 was related to a markedly stronger focus on National Socialist crimes and the Holocaust in Western historiography, which in turn, at least partly, must be related to this stronger focus on a human rights-oriented discourse. The same forces are essential in understanding the critical turn with regard to the resistance. As historians, journalists, and the public embraced a more critical approach to national master narratives, efforts to deconstruct what many like to call the home front history was only natural, given the centrality of the resistance in the patriotic memory. There is no doubt that the more critical approach to dominant narratives, including about the resistance, has brought important new insights. However, much of the current debate on World War II in Norway reflect efforts to instrumentalize the past in order to further specific identities or political agendas in the present. And the potency and character of the current controversy, already mentioned, regarding the resistance, must be understood on this background. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much. We have 4 extremely interesting and thought-provoking papers, which come from countries which we can call Western Europe, but rather Southern Europe, Northern Europe, Central Europe. What is missing is Eastern Europe here. I will ask you a question, which all of you, which rather reflects the long story of memory wars about the Second World War in Eastern Europe and Russia. And I would ask you to answer this question briefly, because we also have some other questions in the pipeline. So the question is, here in Russia, the resolution which was adopted by European Parliament in September 2019 produced a very big impression. And this big impression was not so much about the novelty of the argument, rather about the novelty of the fact that this resolution was almost unanimously supported by the members of the parliament. So instead of the situation in which people in Russia believe that this is the view of East Europeans towards Russia, this tale of two totalitarianisms who are together equally guilty of the beginning of the war and what happened during the war, and only them. We here in Russia discovered that now this narrative is supported by the representatives of all European countries. My question is, was this resolution noticed at all in your societies? And if yes, was there any debate of this resolution? And connected to this, was Putin's article, which was provoked by this resolution, noticed, and was there any reaction to it? Just briefly, please, we can follow the order starting with Xosé.
Right, very briefly, the resolution was barely noted by Spanish civil society, was not even thoroughly reproduced by the media. There were some comments, but I mean, most of my colleagues are too obsessed with the Spanish Civil War. So there is a certain, actually, there is a reflection of this debate. I mean, the idea is, if we accept this tale of two totalitarianisms, this may pave the way for a revisionist interpretation of the Spanish Civil War, according to which both sides were equal. And both sides were equally responsible for the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, which means, at least in the Spanish case, a simplification, because not all Republicans were Stalinists. I mean, Stalinists were a tiny minority of the Republican side during the Spanish Civil War, and it seems to reaffirm or to endorse the revisionist argument, which, according to which, if the Republicans have won the war, then we would have Stalin. And if we had Stalin in 1939, it would be much worse. So at the end, Franco was the lesser evil. So I think this, for this reason, and actually there was no much reflection about this resolution in the Spanish Academy, because I think the last consequences, or the ultimate consequences, would be to resettle and to reframe the explanatory framework of the Spanish Civil War.
Thank you, Xosé. Martin?
In Germany, there was virtually no media coverage of the resolution by the European Parliament. And as a consequence of that, it did not become a topic of public debate. And in the very beginning, there were only a very few reactions to the resolution by individuals on social media. But after a while, historians in Germany realized that that revolution is a part of an ongoing conflict of politics, of history, which involves a couple of governments, be it in the European Union or be it Russia. German historians have voiced concerns over, for instance, the heavy use of the term of totalitarianism in that revolution. I wouldn't go so far as to say that the resolution proposes a narrative. One of the difficult points of that revolution is that there are so many issues lumped together in that resolution. In essence, it's a huge basket of bullet points with pretty much of everything. And for instance, there is one bullet point saying that it's about the singularity of the Holocaust. And my guess is that the German members of the European Parliament had a look at that point and said, well, okay, it's in, so we are in. And then others added on other points. And that probably was very much the way that that resolution came about. I would not read that resolution as something that you can describe as a whole unified European memory, which all members of the European Union would subscribe to.
Thank you. Markku.
Yes, as the others has already said, we didn't have so much public discussion and attention about this resolution. We have had to separate processes on history writing concerning actually Finnish Viking division, SS division, and its work in, I mean, military war crimes and history as a part of occupier of the Soviet Union. That has been one. And the second discussion, what we have conducted quite a long time already, has been that what has been during the wartime attitude and Finnish official attitude and responsibility to returning some Jewish refugees back to Germany and German force, and what is our responsibility for that. But as such, this resolution resembles me also, like I said, that it's a collection of different approaches and parts of discussions, and it's very much about the construction of the European, or attempt to construct the European Union identity, and put on this very political, tense and topical situation vis-a-vis towards Russia. And this is one observation what came to my mind, but not so much discussion, some comments in public.
Okay. Sigurd.
Now, you know, Norway is not even a member of the European Union, but I guess we we tend to identify ourselves with the EU anyway. And well, it did not receive much attention in Norway, but there were some comments on it. One of the leading left-leaning newspaper had an editorial in which they commented on it, and the editorial was very negative, and so were the other reactions in Norwegian newspapers. And I think it was due to one particular paragraph in the resolution, namely the one that said that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had contributed to cause the Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland, which is not incorrect. And I think the vast majority, the reason why it did not receive more attention was probably because this was seen as simply manifestation of how Poland and the Polish memory politics had led to the manipulation of the European Parliament to take this part in. With regards to the Putin article that you also mentioned, it also didn't receive much attention, but it did receive some attention. And Putin actually, in this last summer, was able to publish a summary of his article in the leading Norwegian newspaper Aftenposten. And it didn't really spark any controversy either, but one of my colleagues responded to it in the same newspaper. But most people seem to see both these cases as expressions of the two countries' memory politics, and they tend to consider it some sort of propaganda.
Thank you. Okay, now we have some questions from the audience. Let me start. So there are two questions to Xosé. One question is both questions are from Pavel Gavrilov from St. Petersburg. The first question is, are the Republican Spaniards, red emigres to the USSR, represented in contemporary memory? And the other question is, there were some Spaniards who fought near Leningrad during the war on the Soviet side, and they were taken prisoners. And were these people somehow used in propaganda on the Spanish side? Please. Xosé.
Well, very good questions. Very briefly, as for the first question, yes, these Republican immigrants, these Republican refugees, including many so-called children who had been evacuated in 1937 from Republican Spain and then grew up in Leningrad, Moscow, and other places, and then they enlisted for the Red Army. They are also represented in this memory. They are sometimes used as a kind of counter image, and particularly official institutions since the 1980s have always tried to keep the balance between both, in order to present, for instance, not the memory of the Spanish Blue Division, but the memory of Spaniards on the Eastern Front. The problem is that this strategy was also used by Franco's Spain. 1954, there were in the group of 250 POVs that returned from Russia, from Odessa to Barcelona, the ship. There was also a number of war children, a number of Republican sailors who had been actually kept in Russia in 1939, and also a number of these former combatants of the Red Army who were pardoned, who were forgiven by the Francoist authorities, and they were, let in. This was presented as a magnanimous act of generosity by the Franco regime in order to present them as true Spaniards, because true Spaniards cannot be adopted by the Soviets. At the end, they come back to Spain. And in fact, in some novels and some memoirs, the encounters with Spanish Republican partisans fighting on the side of the Soviets are also described in a very idealized manner. The idea that, well, we protect the Spaniards regardless of which side they are fighting for. But this is the myth. The reality is that those Spaniards, those Spanish partisans who were taken prisoners by the Blue Division, there were around 10, 12, were immediately shot. And sometimes they were shot on the spot, and because they were considered to be traitors. And some of them were repatriated to Spain and then shot in Spain. And another story was that of the children, the so-called Russian children, who had been evacuated in 1937-38. Some of them were then taken prisoners by the Spanish Blue Division. They were sent back to Spain, and it was presented as an act of retaliation, as an act of reprisal against the Soviet Union, as an act of reparation, actually. I mean, these children had been stolen from us by Stalin, and now we get them back. I mean, the story of the Russian children is much more complex, because actually they were allowed to return to Spain in the 1950s and 1960s, but they found increasing difficulties for reintegrating themselves into Spanish society for a number of reasons. So at the end, they usually married among each other to speak Russian among each other. So it's a different story. And the second question was, I think that second question, this was part of the second question as well. So I hope this is more or less responded. Just to, there's a relatively new film, well, some 4 years ago, there was a new film was issued with the name Spansky, reflecting the story of some of these children. And there is a scene, there is a little story about a German squad which takes some Spanish Republican prisoners, and they are about to shoot them on the spot, and then some Spanish soldiers of the Blue Division appear in the forest, and they shoot the Germans and save the Spanish Republicans. So in order to detach themselves from the Germans and say, well, we are fascists, but if someone has to shoot or if someone has to kill a Spaniard, it must be another Spaniard and not a bloody German. And this is what he says. So in a way, both memories are quite intertwined.
See, thank you, Jose. Martin, there are some questions to you from Olga Malinova and Svetlana Soveika, you know both. One question is about what you make of this weakness of debate. What is the state of this situation of memory about the Second World War in Germany? And the second question is, well, rather 3 questions. Then one more question connected to this is, given this weakness, what will be the influence of this Polish-German consultations on German and Polish societies? And finally, the question, in this debate about how to commemorate victims in the East, how important is the question that there are some Russians among these victims in the East? Do Russians who are not necessarily well seen at the moment deserve commemoration? That's it.
Yeah, thank you for these questions. As to the weakness of the debate, my guess is that there are several factors at play here. First, there is that economy of attention, very basically. When we had these huge debates back in the 1980s and the 1990s, we didn't live in a times of constantly overlapping crises as we are used to ever since, well, say 2008. That is reason number one. Reason number two is the structural change of the media sphere. well, in those old days of the 1980s and early 1990s, the printed press very much dominated the public discourse. Well, nowadays it has to confront the internet and social media, which leads to a much more fragmented public sphere. Third, I would argue that there is an illusion of German memory culture. And the story more or less goes that after Germans had been so reluctant to address and to confront what their ancestors had done in the war of annihilation, there has been a debate. There is that monument to the murdered Jews. There are a couple of other monuments. We have learned our lessons at school. And although nobody except the party Alternative for Germany calls openly for an end of the debate, my guess is that there is a certain illusion that more or less we have settled this and we do not need to think that deep and intense about it anymore. Another factor here, probably that's the fourth point, is, well, it's the elephant in the room, I would say, and that is Putin. So in that discussion, virtually nobody mentions Putin at all, while at the same time, a lot of people in that debate are very careful not to propose anything which could be used by the Russian government. And at that point, I would argue that we should always make a very, very clear differentiation between governments and between societies. And what we're trying to develop is nothing which we're doing to please a specific government or a specific head of state or head of government. It's about the communication between societies. So these are a couple of factors you might look at more detailed to come to terms with the question, why is the debate so weak? The second question, the influence of that on Polish-German relations and society. Well, that is the age-old question whether the glass is half full or half empty. Of course, talking to all those who are experts in that bilateral Polish-German field, well, they have a long wish list what they want to see accomplished. And a part of talking about that wish list is to say that relations are bad and that we should do something about it. Judged from the point of view of my own experience over the past 25 years, I would argue that the relationship between Polish and German societies have developed and intensified on so many levels that when we're talking not about governments but about societies, relations are basically very, very, very good. And the third point, the Russians, yes, of course. Well, you cannot talk about how to commemorate victims of Germany's war of annihilation without paying due reference to the Russian victims. And maybe this is the point to illuminate some of the implications of the resolution by the European Parliament. In certain conversations, the entities involved are delineated by are delineated along national lines, and then the discussion refers to the Poles, to the Ukrainians, to the Belarusians, and that is always the point when I'm waiting that the Russians are also added. And it's interesting, for instance, to visit the website of the German Parliament and to listen to all those speeches in Parliament in these two on these two dates when these decisions were made. It's very important to carefully look at each speaker individually. Some of them mention Russians, others do not, and that is something we should we should have a look at, and we should pay due attention that Russian victims are duly referenced in German memory culture. And one last remark, also Soviet victims. Well, it's a little bit awkward to see the term Soviet Union vanish from our conversation about how to commemorate victims of the Second World War. That's also a part of that discourse emerging from the resolution of the European Parliament, I would argue.
Thank you very much. Xosé, would you also switch off your mic, please, the sound? Now I have two more questions, one to Sigurd and another to Markku. Sigurd, it is striking actually that I didn't, so to say, collect the panel so that there would be people from those countries which participated, the representatives of which participated in the siege of Leningrad. But somehow it happened, I now realize it at the moment, that actually Spaniards took part, Finns took part, Germans, of course, took part. And we know that Norwegian volunteers also took part. Is there any story of that? I mean, we have seen from what we talked about today, and it's not for the first time, that of course there are always the same schemes of, how to put it, exporting responsibility, be it on the side of those who fought with the Germans. Bad things were done by the Germans. Yes, we were on the German side, but we were not doing that bad things. When you look on the other side, those who fought with the Soviets, bad things were done by the Russians. We know that. Others were doing good things. And is there anything in this Norwegian discourse about memory of we were there in the siege of Leningrad? Is it part of the story?
Well, as I said in my presentation, the Waffen-SS veterans, they sort of monopolized the memory of this part of the Second World War history in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And they did not, of course, emphasize that they participated in a siege that contributed to the death of hundreds of thousands of people. That it was never in their accounts presented as a deliberate kind of a genocide, an element in a genocide. But they did not, I mean, those Norwegians who served in this particular Norwegian unit, I mean, a German SS unit, but called the Norwegian Legion, they did not, of course, hide the fact that they participated in a trench war outside Leningrad, but they did not emphasize at least their own contribution to this genocidal siege. But they rather focused on the military aspect of their war experience. And sometimes, as with the Spaniards, they also focus on the good relations they often had to the civilian population behind the front lines. And to the extent that atrocities were committed, they, as you suggest, they tended to blame the Germans. I mean, the Germans were responsible. But in recent decades, the discourse has changed. I mean, so from the early 2000s, I would say that the genocidal dimension has appeared much more, has played a much more significant role in the discourse on the volunteers. Actually, it has been the question of atrocities in general has been the most debated issue, not only with regard to the siege of Leningrad, but also to the Norwegians who served in the Viking division, which was mentioned by Markku. You know, maybe 800 Norwegians served in the Viking division and took part in the German invasion in the summer of '49. They were present in Western Ukraine during the large-scale Nazi atrocities committed there, and also in numerous other atrocities. And this has been a major controversy, or at least it was a major controversy in the early 2000s, where when many volunteers were still alive and could take part in the debate. But by now, I think the research has been so compelling that they were involved in and they were aware of the large-scale atrocities that were committed, and they were taking part in or involved in the Nazi crimes at different levels, in different places, different parts, different times during the war. So I think the debate is more or less closed by now, but as Martin also mentioned, the public debate today is much more fragmented, and I'm sure that you can still find rooms in the internet that these apologetic narratives still live on, but in the national newspapers and so on, this apologetic discourse has been completely marginalized.
Thank you, Sigurd. Markku, you probably know that during the last 2 years, there is a clearly cut Russian memory policy to extend our memory war towards Finland also. There is a lot of media coverage of Finnish occupational practices in Karelia. And it is very clear that now Russian memory politics emphasize victimhood and emphasize this issue of Russians as victims of genocide. Just 2 or 3 weeks ago, Russian court for the first time issued a ruling which describes a crime during the Second World War as genocide. It was about German and, if I remember correctly, Latvian units involved in around Novgorod. But in Karelia, they have constructed a kind of a, I don't know how to call it, concentration camp as a museum where they take kids to show how Finns treated local Russian population. And frankly speaking, I don't understand why they are doing that, but they are doing that. And the question my question to you is, what is a reaction in Finnish society to that? Is it subject to debate? What are the responses, etc.?
Well, I would say that it's somehow the continuation of the debate over the Sandarmo and Finnish victims killed on this cemetery during the Stalinist purges. It is estimated that there is probably 6,000, even 9,000 Finns who have executed there, who lived on this area during in 1920s and 30s, and it continued this history political dispute and discussion over it, and it was after that came the case of Yuri Dmitriev, who was arrested. I don't know if I guess that in St. Petersburg, you people who are following this know the case, and he was accused for several reasons, and in Finland it was interpreted quite widely that the accusations and his sentence has been political. There has been political reasons behind it, and because he revealed the Sandarmo and Krasny Bor cemetery or execution places, and this history of that, and reaction of the decision to construct this so artificial concentration camp for Russian kids, it has put onto the same context of this, like you mentioned, those history wars, and of course the case is that there is a real history behind it, that Finnish occupation army established these concentration camps, but on the place where has been decided to construct this fake new museum of concentration camp, or whatever you can call it, there is no historical grounds on this place about it, and before the decision has been made, the Ministry of Interior, the FSB, decided to reveal new documents, which were actually not the new documents, but old documents. And based on these documents, they were interviews of the people who had spent time or who had been arrested in these concentration camps and other civilian population, and there has been accusations of all kind of war crimes, which like that Finns used the gas to kill civilian population, detented these camps, which is not true, and that kind of things, and these documents are well known already from 1950s and 60s, when historians and Russian or Soviet and Finnish historians have discussed about this, and about these accusations also they have dealt. But it was the launch of this campaign, and after that, campaign against, I would say that against Finland in history war. And the sad story is that it lead attention away of this real history and the victims of this civil population, which really were on this, and which Finns put to these concentration camps, and away from their sufferings, because politicians have started to use this and giving the false information and fake information, and raising up that kind of claims of atrocities which didn't really happen in this place. It was enough what really happened there, and that has been the discussion here. Finnish side has, or our National Archive has welcomed Russian historians and whoever has been interested in to our archives, which are open for research, and we have also suggested to do or cooperate with the real history and these events. And the reaction has been that we are open, of course, to all, I mean, fact-based new findings as well. But that has been presented for now. It's there is nothing new and only new history war interpretations. It has been covered in our media quite widely. You can find it from there.
Well, gentlemen, we worked for 2 hours and 15 minutes. It was not boring, at least for me, definitely. I've got a lot to think about. In usual times, we would continue our talks during the coffee break or lunch or whatever. But I'll be back to all of you with some suggestions about contributions, tax contributions. And we shall send you the link to the place on YouTube where this discussion is going to be available. And we shall add 2 more papers there from our colleagues from Portugal and Italy who could not participate for technical reasons. And maybe you could share it with your colleagues, I mean, in your countries. So thank you very, very much. Hope to see you all in St. Petersburg in more peaceful times.
Thank you, Alexander. Others.
Thank you so much, Alexei. Спасибо
Goodbye.
большое. Всего хорошего. До свидания.